The snow lay like a soft judgment over the prairie, and the moon, thin as a blade of glass, sliced through the night, turning frost into glittering constellations that clung to barbed wire and the tips of sagebrush as if the land itself were listening for a forgotten prayer. In the middle of this vast quiet rode a man named Elias, a cowboy whose hat had seen more storms than most men could stomach, and who carried with him the weight of names he never spoke aloud. He had wandered from town to town, from one memory to the next, his boots leaving tracks that traced a map of lonely miles and late-night promises he could not keep. Christmas had always been a season of light and laughter for others, but for him it had become a ritual of remembrance, of a home that never truly existed, of a family he had imagined, in the creak of a wooden floor, and the warmth of a kettle left to simmer on a stove that never quite warmed the corners. Where hope slept, that night a promise hung in the air like a sigh, a reunion that seemed improbable, a letter that had somehow found him again after years of silence. The town he passed through was barely a whisper, a cluster of weather-beaten buildings that wore the wind like a medal of honor. In the saloon's painted glass, the reflection of a world that moved too quickly to notice the ache in a man's eyes. Elias stood in the doorway, letting the cold fold him like a cloak, and he watched as the old piano coughed out a ghostly melody that hadn't learned to die. The bartender, a woman with hands calloused from weather and work, looked up with a glance that knew him better than most, and she poured a drink that wasn't offered so much as earned. A small, careful amount of warmth against the chill that clung to his bones. In that warmth came a name that felt more like a weather system than a memory. Maeve. The name drifted into the room as if carried by a gust of winter wind, and with it came a presence that did not demand attention but rather coaxed it, like a beacon at the edge of a foggy coast. Maeve stood in the doorway of a back room where the stories of the town gathered, like moths around a lantern. She wore the kind of quiet strength that doesn't shout, the kind of grace earned from weathering storms, both literal and metaphorical. Her eyes, a hunter's focus and a healer's mercy, found Elias and held him there, not with judgment but with recognition. It wasn't the lover's gaze that might have sparked a different life for him, but something older, something more like a vow he owed to a past he had wrongfully buried under layers of music and whiskey. She spoke in a voice that sounded like the rain finding the earth after a drought, soft but insistent, carrying the weight of truth without the bite of accusation. "You came back," she said, as if the years had folded themselves into a single sentence. For a moment, Elias felt the horizon tilt, the sense of a boundary redefined. He nodded, not trusting his own voice to form the words he wanted to say, words that would confess the distance. He had walked not just across land but across a life. He had tried to escape by riding away from every dawn. Maeve did not press him for confessions. Instead, she offered him a chair by the stove, a space where the warmth was real, and the conversation could begin without the noise of a crowd. And in that space, the town's stories began to unfold again, not as gossip or rumor, but as a shared memory of what Christmas could mean when it is allowed to arrive with quiet insistence, rather than the loud, sugary clamor of holiday songs. The night deepened, and the rain turned to snow in the way that promises a change of seasons without guarantee. They spoke in careful cadences, about the routes they had chosen and the things they had lost along the way, the people they had loved who didn't survive the winter of their own expectations, the promises that had been kept only by accident, the nights when the world felt too large to hold in two hands. They traded stories not as a way to fill a space, but as if each tale were a map, a compass needle that steadies a traveler who has forgotten which way home, looks when seen from a road he never intended to travel again. Elias confessed the ache that haunted him on nights when the wind sounded like the shoreline of a life he had never allowed himself to live. And Maeve listened as if every word weighed something sacred, as if to hear him was to be given the chance to forgive himself for things he did not know how to forgive. As the hour grew late, a plan formed, not one born of reckless bravado, but of a careful, stubborn hope. He would ride again at dawn, not to chase ghosts, but to chase the possibility that a future could be different from the past, that a Christmas Eve might carry more than the memory of what was lost. Maeve offered him a simple, practical gift, a letter, written in her hand, describing a place at the edge of a map where old men told stories to passing travelers and where a seat by the fire could become a throne for a man who believed himself unworthy of warmth. Elias accepted not as a confession of need, but as a pledge to something larger than his loneliness, the chance to become someone capable of returning to a home he had never truly known, to stand not in the shadow of a shadow, but in the glow of a possibility he hadn't allowed himself to imagine. When the night finally began to breathe again, and the first pale light of Christmas Eve painted the horizon, Elias stepped outside to look at the world as it woke. The snow lay white and patient, and the air carried the quiet sound of the prairie listening. Maeve's presence lingered with him, not as a memory he could own or a dream he could claim, but as a sign that a road could lead somewhere beyond regret. And though the road ahead was uncharted, and the trail of his own choices still tangled, he walked toward the morning with a steadier heart, a sense that perhaps the loneliness that had defined him for so long could be softened, not erased, but softened by a boundary crossing, connection that asked for nothing more than honesty, time, and the courage to try again. The chapter closes on the moment when Elias mounts his horse at the edge of town. Maeve stands at the porch, the firelight catching the edge of her smile, a quiet invitation and a challenge wrapped in one, to greet the day as a chance to be more than the memory of a man who once rode away from a deeper truth. The night exhales, and the road that lies ahead, though uncertain, holds the promise of a Christmas that might finally be about coming home to a place inside himself he kept locked away for years. The dawn after a long night of weathered hopes arrived with a pale, forgiving light. The town woke as if exhaling a held breath, storefronts glinting with frost like jewels, and the air carrying the old scent of cedar and smoke, a reminder that some things endure even when people do not. Elias rode with a pace that was neither hurried nor lazy, a deliberate rhythm that spoke of a decision finally being kept, of a body aligned with a purpose that was older than the excuses that had kept him away. The road stretched out before him, a ribbon of possibility that curved, with the land and the memory of a Christmas he had almost learned to believe could be real. Maeve's letter lay in his pocket, a kind of map folded in on itself, with directions to a place where stories gathered and perhaps a chance to share one that hadn't yet found its audience. The journey was not merely a physical act but an inward pilgrimage, a sorting of the past into bundles of regret and mercy, of what he owed to those he had loved and what he owed to himself for letting fear dictate the lines of his life. Each mile he rode carried with it a small confession, the ache of a winter that had become a fortress, the realization that the fort he had built around his heart had become a prison he needed to unlock with someone who could see him not as a sum of wrong turns but as a person who deserved a second chance to write a better ending. The town at the road's end welcomed him with the same quiet restraint that Maeve carried in her voice. It wasn't a place where grand declarations or dramatic reunions took center stage. Rather, it was a setting where small acts of humanity, an elderly couple sharing hot chow, a child gifting a handmade star, a bar that served as a shelter for the tired and the hopeful could become the tinder for a larger, transformative flame. He found the place Maeve had described not as a grotesque parlor game of fate, but as a simple, honest room with a window, looking out over the land that had both given and taken from him. It was there, across the room, that Maeve appeared not as a memory, but as a living contradiction to the loneliness he had carried for years. Her presence was a weather system changing the forecast, a gentle, persistent wind that refused to settle for a bleak horizon. Their conversation did not rush toward a single declaration but wandered through the terrain of what had happened and why it had happened. Each word a brick laid toward a structure of reconciliation. Maeve spoke of the town's Christmas Eve vigil, the way the people gathered beneath the clock tower, sharing stories as if the cold were merely a test of their resolve to hold each other up. She spoke of the old barn, where a chorus of neighbors sang carols to raise spirits and to remind one another that joy can arrive unannounced, wrapped in the simple warmth of companionship. Elias listened, not to plead for forgiveness but to learn what it could mean to be part of a community, again to belong without feeling the need to pretend he was someone else. As daylight waned, a plan began to form with the clarity of a star suddenly visible in a cloudless sky. He would contribute to the vigil, not to seek redemption in a single moment of grand theater, but to stand as a living testament that a man can change trajectory, not by erasing the past, but by choosing what to do with the future. Maeve would join him, not as a guide who dictated the terms of his life, but as a partner who would walk with him through the awkward, tender process of rebuilding trust. They spoke of small acts like repairing a fence on the edge of the town, like donating time to the kitchen at the shelter, like letting a child's hand rest in his for a heartbeat, longer than etiquette required. These small choices, they discovered, could become the architecture of a life worth living again. The night grew thick with starlight and the soft murmur of the vigil's preparations. People gathered, a circle of neighbors and strangers who recognized in each other the stubborn hope that Christmas could still be a season of light, not just a memory of lights. Elias stepped into the glow of the gathering, the air perfumed with pine and rain-sweetened smoke, and he felt a surprising thing: ownership. Not ownership over Maeve or the town, but ownership over the future he was about to claim, the future in which loneliness would still exist but would no longer define him. When he took the stage, if one could call it that, the improvised platform of a porch, a crate of cider, a chorus of 24 voices, he did not seek applause. He spoke simply, with a voice steadied by the long road and the long night, and the longer years of self-reckoning. He spoke of a longing not to possess but to belong, of a life in which the space between memory and possibility could gradually disappear, replaced by a new pattern of days that looked less like absences and more like presences. People who chose to stay, to build, to care. Maeve listened from the edge, her eyes bright with something tender and fierce at once. When Elias finished, she stepped forward and placed a quiet hand on his arm, not to claim him but to acknowledge the work he had already done on himself. In that moment, the crowd found a way to cheer, not for a single moment of dramatic revelation, but for the durable choice to keep moving forward together. The vigil concluded with a ceremonial lantern release, a small, luminous surrender to the night sky, a symbol that even in a world of hardship, the light could travel farther than the darkness. As the lanterns drifted upward, Elias felt the first true sense of belonging he had tasted in years, the sensation that he was not the sum of his past mistakes, but rather a man who had learned to carry them with a new gentleness toward a future that remained unwritten but inviting. The quiet that followed the crowd's departure was not empty but full of a different kind of resonance. Maeve and Elias walked through the snow toward the edge of town, where the fence line met the open fields, where the world seemed to stretch out without obligation or pretense. They spoke softly about what the next days might hold, about how to balance the old impulses to run with new commitments to stay. They did not pretend the path ahead would be simple or without pain, but they did promise each other to tend it with patience, humor, and a willingness to make amends not as a duty but as a daily practice. In the end, Christmas Eve did more than reunite old strangers. It reintroduced a future to two people who had learned to live with the absence of certainty. It offered them a chance to craft a life that honored what had been lost while opening a door to what might still be gained. The quiet power of companionship, the stubborn endurance of hope, and the humble courage to try again one day at a time. The road back to that new life, Elias realized, wasn't a single march but a series of small, steadfast steps taken together, with Maeve always walking beside him, sometimes in silence, sometimes in a shared breath, toward a dawn that would be theirs to greet. The final scene lingers on the two of them near the barn, the sky pale with the first light of Christmas, a single horse stamping through fresh snow as if stamping its approval on a future that has finally begun to take shape. Maeve smiles, not as an end to the loneliness but as a promise that it could be transformed by love, patient and honest, into something that could heal rather than hollow out. Elias returns the smile, not with bravado but with a steady, quiet gratitude. The town hums awake around them, and in its ordinary, stubborn way, it seems to say, Christmas comes for those who are willing to open the door and invite it in. And sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that begin not with a single, decisive act but with the quiet choice to keep showing up, day after day, for the sake of warmth, belonging, and a future that feels worth the risk of hope.